So we've been deep diving into fasting. You've probably heard that word 1,001 times, but we're going to go a little more into it. I hope it's not just mental understanding, but it's natural application as well in your life. But I want to read you something from C.S. Lewis. If you were to ask 20 good men today what they thought the highest of the virtues were, 19 of them would reply, unselfishness. But if you were to ask almost any of the great Christians of old, they would have replied, love. Do you see what's happened? A negative term has been substituted for a positive, and this is more than just a philosophical importance. The negative ideal of unselfishness carries with it the suggestion not of primarily securing good things for others, but of going without them yourself, as if your abstinence and not their happiness was the important point. I do not think this is the Christian virtue of love. The New Testament has a lot to say about self-denial, but not self-denial as an end in itself. We are told to deny ourselves, to take up our cross in order that we may follow Christ. And nearly every description of what we will find ultimately contains an appeal to desire. Now, he's referring to the idea and the virtue of love here in The Weight of Glory, and that was C.S. Lewis. But I think it shows us something that we've also done with fasting, a negative term being substituted for a positive. Yes, there is a self-denial in fasting, and yes, it is a point in it, and a lot that needs to be said about the removing and learning self-control, which is a fruit of the Spirit from Galatians 5, and looking at these things. But it is not the end of itself to say, I deny myself, and that is the point. No, in fact, the point is to procure the goodness of God, not just in your lives, but in those around you. And that's kind of what Lewis is pointing out here in this writing. Now, he's talking about love and how we've turned it into this just go without the thing, and that is somehow the main point. But he says, no, that's not the main point of love at all. It's actually getting the goodness for someone else, which is exactly what Christ has done for us, which is why we are sitting here today devoting our lives, because he gave his life. And that's exactly what we see that we've done with fasting, though. We've made it primarily into the removal, what we're giving up. And indeed, we tend to focus on that so much that we miss the replacement that we're really supposed to be focusing on. We really miss the idea that it wasn't just self-denial that somehow did something in us. It was actually the replacement that pushed us further into knowing God, or that should be pushing us in this moment right now as we're fasting social media and we are fasting one meal a day. And as the rest of this journey continues even, we're going to be fasting more things. It is a full-on detox of removing everything, every distraction and desire, just as Lewis says here, because everything ultimately is an appeal to desire. He goes on later in this writing to talk about how our desires are set too low and not too high. God doesn't seem to think our desires are too great and too much to handle, so he's trying to get rid of them. In fact, he's trying to show us that our desires of life, our desires of what we think joy and fulfillment really is set so low that he says, if you'll remove those, I can show you fullness and goodness. But at first, it won't seem appealing. We used some of that quote earlier in the journey. I encourage you to go read that writing called The Weight of Glory by C.S. Lewis. It deals with a lot of this things that we're talking about desire and removal and replacement, although he doesn't talk about fasting specifically. But I want to hone in just a little bit more on this idea of our desires being set too low and going to a higher desire, a higher fulfillment of joy, peace, and so on. Not just in our own lives, but for those around us. I want to use this example of a child maybe. That, let's say this child is at the store with their parent, and as they're at the store with the parent, as every child does, they see the candy or the toy aisle and they say, "Can I get something?" And the parent, if money provides, says, well, yes, you can get something. But as we all know, what that child does is they grab 2 or 3, candies or toys, and they say, "Can I get both?" And to which the parent would reply and say, "No, you have to choose one." And the child has to sit there and to remove one and put it down to choose which one they want. That is kind of what fasting is for us. As God is saying, you cannot have 2 lives. You can be in the world, but you can't be of the world and follow Christ. So you have to choose. Which would you want? And then we take that analogy a little bit further. Because then later on, that child may be playing with that brand new toy that seems to be all the joy that the child could ever want and hope for. But the parent says, hey, we're gonna go. You need to put the toy down and leave it at home. Now, a disciplined child would not throw a fit, but as we know, that is something we don't see much in our world today. And so the child balks and squawks and kicks and screams and says no, and the parent says, we are not leaving until you put down that toy. Unbeknownst to the child, the parent is trying to say, we're gonna go because there's something grander. We're going to whatever it may be. We're gonna go get ice cream, or we're gonna go to the theme park. We're going to go do something, but that can't come with you. And that's the position we find ourselves in as well with fasting. We have got this desire in our lives, these things, whether it be social media, whether it be food, whether it be whatever. And God is trying to say, if you will look, you're actually only given over to your base things, not to the higher things I've called you to. And it's not just called you to a higher thing that's more responsibility. Yes, there's responsibility in it, but he's saying, no, that's actually, there is something greater. It is not necessarily greater, don't get it twisted, that it is greater in the sense of you will no longer have trials and struggles. We've already learned that the trials come to test us, to prove we're ready for the next level. So trials and tests are not a bad thing. What we've actually learned is that he says, no, what I have is fulfillment. What I have is infinite joy offered, but you do have to put down the other. Fasting is teaching us that. Fasting is saying, I remove the base lower desires that are not really the real stuff of life that drives me. And I replace it with the stuff that really does. As Jesus says in the wilderness, man does not live by bread alone, the base desire, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Why? The instructions of God are life-giving. The instructions of God, if followed, bring about the goodness in this world for us and for those around us. And so fasting is that practice, that kind of rhythm that we keep implementing in our life, whether it be weekly like the ancient Christians did, whether it be monthly, whether it even be daily of certain times and portions of it, to say, I give away that base desire because I know wherever God's taking me is further in, further up, and is more joy and more fulfillment. And as we've been looking at all of these people in Scripture, we've been seeing just that. We've been seeing their game days. We've been seeing their on-stage moments, so to speak, of Moses going up and down the mountain, and of Daniel and him standing firm in the face of adversity and all these types of things. We've seen all of this, but what we're looking at is simply a glimpse of, if you want to think of it this way, their professional game day, their on-stage moment. What we're not looking at is all of the weeks and months and years leading up to that prepared them to be able to function in that way. No different than a professional athlete. When you see them play, it looks effortless for them to hit a home run or to shoot a three-pointer on the court. Why? Because of hours and hours of practice. And when we look at Moses, how come when he went up the mountain and he spent all this time with God and fasting and things like that, when God speaks to the children of Israel, they get scared to run. They can't stand in that time and that day, and so they get afraid and run because they had no endurance in it. But yet Moses says, no, you guys come closer because God is taking us. He's doing this so we won't miss the mark, so we won't sin. He's trying to draw us in. How could Moses stand so confident and so firm in that? Because of all the hours in the past. And as the children of Israel left, he goes back up the mountain. How do we get Daniel being able to stand when everyone else in Israel is bending to Nebuchadnezzar, is bending to the way that they eat and so on? How can Daniel say, no, I'm not going to, because God has already given me words and commands? He wasn't able to perform, if you will. He wasn't able to act that out in that moment without practice daily, without staying dedicated to the things that God had already commanded. Fasting is one of these dedications. Fasting is simply a practice that puts us into the realm to be able to say no to the base desires and yes to the God desires, or even to create those desires. And that's what we're doing in this fast. That's why we're going so extreme with it. I know many people think it's like, this is insanity to do things this way. This is crazy. It's not necessary. I'd like to put this thought on for size. If this is a relationship with Christ as we say it is, we can't deal in what's necessary and not necessary. Or like, we can't be towing on the line. Why? Because if I went to my wife and I said, honey, like, I know we're married, but like, is it necessary that I come home every night? we would all laugh at that, as rightfully you should, because we know, what are you talking about? Like, why would you even get married if you had no real intent of being home every night? And this should speak to us the same way with Christ. And so if we're ever dealing in those things, this is crazy, this is insane. We need to evaluate, are we really looking at this as a relationship with Christ? That we say, I would rather have you than I would my base desires. Because that's what's set before us. His life or our life. And I want to leave you with that today. And as we go into the remainder of this week and we have discussion tomorrow, in your times of prayer, let this run over you and seep down into you of the idea of, I'm set before a choice, like a child at the toy store or the candy store. Can I get both? And he says, no. God says, no, you got to pick one or the other. And then maybe we're saying, okay, I picked this one. He says, but I got even somewhere further. If you'll put that down, I can take you even further.